right, my AP literature friends. So Christian Kuhn, also known as the Bob Ross of Composition, coming at you here for another writing workshop video. And in today's video, I'm going to spotlight the AP Literature exam FRQ2 from the 2023 exam, Set 2, The Rock Eaters by Brenda Peinato. I really enjoyed this one, and it's tricky. It kind of reminds me of the octopus piece a little bit in terms of the complexity and the texture of it. There's a lot going on in this. And full disclosure, my students came back and half of them said I crushed it and half of them said it completely eluded me. I wasn't really sure what to do with this. So what I'll do in this video is kind of stick to status quo and do what I normally do. We'll deconstruct the prompt together. I'll show you how my students manipulate my inverted thesis template in order to house the introductory paragraph. Then we will build body paragraphs together using my syllogistic method template. And then to make the whole essay from start to finish, I'll show you some sentence stems my students use to write their conclusion paragraph. So settle in and strap up your safety belts. We are going to start with the prompt. So here it is. The following excerpt is from Brenda Peinato's short story, The Rock Eaters, published in 2021. In this passage, the narrator is one of a group of people who left their home country after developing the ability to fly, an ability that is accepted as realistically possible within the story. Years later, the group returns to that country with their children. Read the passage carefully, then in a well-written essay, analyze how Peinato uses literary elements and techniques to convey the narrator's complex experience of this return home. So it's very similar, I think, to the octopus piece from last year. And yet again, we have a story that, in a sense, is allegorical. And I think if students struggled with it, at least my students, they failed to pick up on the fact that there are some allegorical undercurrents in this. And I think students read very literally, and you kind of have to dip into the nuance of this a little bit in order to make sense of it, heads or tails. So our first question is this, right? You get your head around the prompt, you read the passage, you've ascertained its meaning, you've done as close a read as possible as you possibly can as a student on exam day, and you're staring at your blank screen or your blank sheet of paper, and you ask yourself this: so, how do I write the introductory paragraph? So on exam day, we don't want our students second guessing themselves and saying, is an introduction 11 sentences long? Is it 16 sentences long? Can I just do a one sentence literary terms dumping ground, right? It has to be instinctual, intuitive, and almost habitual come exam day. And one way to guarantee that that happens is this: you got to Bob Ross your instruction and provide plenty of models and exemplars throughout the year. And here's what I always tell teachers when I work with them, whether I'm doing, just consulting or with my teachers through the National Writing Project. If you position yourself as the Bob Ross of composition in your classroom, you position yourself as the expert writer. Just like Bob Ross always got to the easel and canvas and he painted his way through something with us, we have to get to the proverbial easel and canvas and paint intros with our students, paint body paragraphs, show them how to do the quote transitions, right? So that's when you explicitly teach writing instead of merely assign it. And the cool thing with Bob Ross is that he used a heuristic. In composition, we often call it a template. He used something called the wet on wet technique. And with my students, they know that they can either declare or invert the thesis. So there's two templates for the introductory paragraph. All body paragraphs, regardless of expository mode, can be written with the syllogistic method. And then for the conclusion, they have about 10 stem options that they can choose from, and they just crush it. So all the guesswork is out of the frame come exam time. So there's a little cheat or a hack that I like to alert teachers and students to with regards to FRQ1 and FRQ2 on the AP Literature exam. implicit in any prompt, and I challenge you to do this. You can go back to the 1970s if you want to. In all FRQ1 and FRQ2 prompts, you have implicit two questions, right? So in the prompt we just read, we're really being asked two questions. What is the author's intent, and how does the author construct meaning? And what my students do is they focus 3 sentences on what is the author's intent and 1 sentence on how does the author construct meaning. Now, we call this an inverted thesis because you end with your thesis. So I broke this down graphically for you here. So whenever you answer the question, how does the author construct meaning? That comprises the thesis statement. That constitutes the thesis statement. So students are going to end with the thesis. That's why we call it an inverted. In a declarative, you begin with the thesis. So 3 sentences, what is the authorial intent? 1 sentence, construction of meaning. And when we articulate the sentence in which we house the construction of meaning, we have to drop our terms, devices, and techniques, right? It's a literary thesis statement. So there's other things that go into this. We're going to lead with context and background, kind of the exigence, the universal theme, the universal truth of the piece. That's the first 3 sentences. We don't want to regurgitate the story or plot summarize it or anything of that nature. We definitely don't want to quote. We don't want any analysis in that introduction whatsoever. The 2 other things that I require my students to sprinkle in: Tier 2 level vocabulary. By that, I mean SAT level caliber words. Pay attention to my students' vocab in here. It's the byproduct of my Word Study Academy. All year long, from the day after Labor Day all the way till exam, they go through an intensive Word Study Academy with me. So I really help them grow their vocabularies, just augment it exponentially over the course of the academic year. So that they can cop nice academic tones. The other thing we work on extensively are ways to achieve voice rhythm and flow. I really think that's essential to the sophistication point, the ability to be able to wield a variety of sentence constructs. So as many of you know, I'm a big proponent of teaching students rule number 18 from Strunk and White's seminal text called Write It Right. So rule number 18 makes the assertion that there's 12 different ways to cobble together a single sentence. And my students, and you'll see in their samples here in just a second, can write with flair. They can write with pizzazz. They know how to wield, different syntactical arrangements with purpose and effect. So oftentimes struggling and emerging writers will just simply use independent clauses and short, simple declarative sentences. So you get that droning da-da-da-da-da-da-da-da-da-da kind of rhythm. Totally precludes yourself from getting the sophistication point if you can only wield 2 to 3 of the 12 sentence constructs. So my students can do it all. And then it's going to be 4 sentences, as I alluded to earlier. 3 sentences, authorial intent, 1 sentence, construction of meaning. And that's what I have here. Let's recap. 3 plus 1 equals the intro. 3 sentences, authorial intent. Some people call that universal truth, exigence, universal theme. I call it authorial intent. 1 sentence, construction of meaning. So let's take a look at student number 1 and what they did here. And after the exam, my students came back and we wrote these in preparation for next year's students for their review. So these are student samples, and we really debated the authorial intent. We split this in a couple of directions, and I think some students clearly read it better than others. But nonetheless, you can see how this 3+1 paradigm works regardless of the read. So I think one of the examples in here, the student has a slight misread, and I'll point that out when we get there. So here's student number 1. In many regards, one's life is ultimately governed by the majority principle. Similar to lemmings, man will invariably throw himself over the proverbial cliff into a pool of mass conformity just in order to fit in, so as not to be an individualistic outlier. And a compelling force that leads one to blindly follow is the collective sense that the grass is greener on the other side, which it never is. So we're 3 sentences in. Let's get to the construction of meaning. Brenda Paynato arrives at these sentiments in her short story, The Rock Eaters, primarily through a generational contrast as well as her syntactical manipulation of plural pronouns. So in that last sentence, the thesis statement, I have my students focus on the most salient terms in the piece or make it exclusively a thematically heavy thesis statement, and then they save the lit terms, devices, and techniques for the syllogistic body paragraphs. But this student is saying that, that juxtaposition or the binary between the dichotomy between the generations, and then all the syntactical pizzazz in this are really important. So in the first three sentences, this is what we contested as a class in terms of the read. So the idea of mass conformity and the idea that the grass isn't always greener on the other side. We thought that those two statements were kind of at the heart of this story. So that's the direction we're going in. All right, let's do that again. Let's see it all over again and see what student number 2 does in terms of the 3+1 paradigm. So here's student number 2's introduction. Oftentimes, man unknowingly consents to being blindfolded as he traverses this thing called life. As such, he blindly complies and follows the masses without so much as a second thought. This is often the case when collections of people cease to water the proverbial grass upon which they stand and instead search for greener pastures. So we're 3 sentences in, and again, they're doing the same read as the first one. That was kind of the consensus in my class, is how we read it. Brenda Paynato explores this phenomenon in her short story, The Rock Eaters, through a generational binary as well as her employment of plural pronouns. So those seem to be the 2 big things that my students focused on in their appraisal of this. So again, 3+1, 3 authorial intent, 1 construction of meaning. So this looks tough, right? It looks like it's pretty hard to do, but my students have been with me a whole academic year. So I just want to say, yes, you can if you're seeing this for the first time. It's practice, practice, practice. Teacher, position yourself as the expert writer. Model this for your students. Get to the easel, get to the canvas, and they'll be able to approximate your work in no time at all. So here's a student, very concrete writer, student number 3. And they're very basic, very dutiful writer. There's usually not too much fireworks in this student's writing, but they're very like a math science sort of kid, and they have a certain pragmatism and sparsity of words in their writing. So look at how student number 3 did it. For some individuals, they look upon the well-trodden path and immediately assume that the new trails they blaze will be a ginormous improvement. History knows of many such societies of people who errantly subscribe to this notion. Simply put, new paradigms of doing things do not always supersede old and long-standing traditional ways of life. Brenda Paynato allegorically arrives at such an understanding in her short story, The Rock Eater. So this kid focused on the allegory, which I think is really important to highlight that allegory. So somewhere in the essay, you kind of have to hit upon that. But again, it's 3+1. Note the vocab in all 3. This one, I like well-trodden path. Ginormous is nice. Errantly, subscribed, paradigms, supersede. Very good vocab. The sentence structures are all nice and supple and flowy. And one little piece of advice I give my students is this, and some teachers disagree with me on this, but I'm sticking to my guns. I really don't like it when my students parallel their sentence structures in the introductory paragraph, because then you get that droning rhythm. You got that da-dot kind of rhythm. So I would tell them this. If you have a reason to parallel, and it's a really, really, really good reason, and you can articulate it, then by all means do it. Take the training wheels off, tear down the scaffolds. But typically, I tell them don't parallel. Vary your sentence structures so that out of the gate, you're getting that voice rhythm and flow. So I think all 3 of these students, an AP reader would get to the end and say, wow, if these kids can sustain this for the duration of the paper, they're definitely in contention for the sophistication point. So they're all, systematically going to get the thesis point. And then they have that added degree of sparkle and nuance that puts them in contention for the unicorn point. So at this stage of the game, if you're following along with me and running a writing workshop, I would pause the video, have students draft their own introductions. And then I'm a big proponent of this. The more writing students see, the better they become. So maybe do a gallery walk or a chalk talk, put a couple on the projector, throw a few in a PowerPoint slide, and break them down and writing workshop them. So the more writing they see, the better they're going to become. And as always, I encourage teachers to write a few of your own. All right, introductions are done. So we have our next pivotal question. So, how do I write the body paragraphs? And my tacit response to that, always, regardless of expository mode, is this. You're going to bust out the syllogistic method. So let me give a quick cursory overview of the syllogistic method. It's rooted in the Aristotelian tradition, comes from Aristotle. He ran a school called the Lyceum, and the aristocratic boys would go there to learn about polemics, oration, debate, wordsmithing, word wrangling. And they'd often throw out these juicy essential questions like, what is justice? Which is the essential question of the seminal text, Plato's Republic. And the scholars and the philosophers would step to the proverbial mic and they would drop their definition of justice, thinking they were all hot stuff. And then the other scholars and philosophers would find all the bullet holes. And Aristotle sat there scratching his head saying, geez, why are some of my students really fantastic at housing their arguments? They're really good orators. Some are men, some just tank bomb. And one day he had a eureka moment. He said, I got it. Aha. Some of my students packaged their arguments syllogistically. And this was kind of my eureka moment early in my career as a composition instructor. Really good writers intuitively write syllogistically. And it's just a computative mathematical package of thought. So if I were to say to you, premise number 1, arsenic is deadly, you'd all say, Christian, yup, you are correct. That's absolutely 100% correct. But then if I slip in the second premise and say, my dog ate arsenic, you're all going to naturally conclude, uh-oh, Christian, this is not going to bode well for your dog. It's probably going to die. Aristotle would look at that syllogistic example right there and say, Christian, that's cogent. That's lockstep bulletproof logic. And when our students argue on paper, we want them to have all three components of that argument. And oftentimes what happens, though, in composition is that students only present the second premise, and that's why it's so plot heavy. It reads like a Cliff Note summation. So how do we turn this into a template for the purposes of performing literary analysis? Here's the breakdown. So you're going to have a first premise, a second premise, and a conclusion all in one body paragraph. So all three of these are going to be in a body paragraph. And the body paragraph is going to be about 10 to 12 sentences long. So those little itty bitty baggers, the 4 or 5 sentences, don't cut it. There's not enough support or analysis in there to really advance and flesh out a literary argument. So I encourage my kids to go for 10 to 12. The first 3 sentences are going to be an argument containing the terms, devices, techniques, and I'll model this for you in just a second. So 3 sentences, that way it keeps the centrality of the argument. On FRQ 1 of the AP Lang exam, the College Board says many times, your argument must be central. And I really think that we need to tell our kids that for the FRQs on the AP Lit exam too, because we're doing literary analysis, it's expository writing, therefore it's an argument. We have to argue with our devices, techniques, and terms. Second premise is going to be textual support. We're going to teeter-totter balance the quoting and the paraphrasing. And then the conclusion of the body paragraph. Remember that. Body paragraphs need conclusions. The conclusion of the body paragraph is where we're going to echo and link back to the prompt and the thesis statement, right? So it all comes full circle, 10 to 12 sentences. So you might ask yourselves, what's this first premise that Christian's talking about? And a first premise is 3 sentences long, and it's the articulation of the argument, the central argument of the piece that is, anchored in terms, devices, techniques. So there are some stems that I'm going to want you to write down. One stem that I give my students is this, right from the onset. Most of the time, my students will begin their first body paragraph with those 4 words plus the comma, right from the onset, comma. It cues your reader into knowing that you have a mythology, a chronology, a sequence of your analysis, because students often ask, where do I begin? And I always tell them, begin where the author begins, begin where Peinato begins. So right from the onset. And then we're just going to cherry pick the terms, the devices, techniques that Peinato employs up top in the short story, and we're just going to pick like 2 or 3. I call this multitasking because we got to break kids of the habit of one paragraph tone, one paragraph syntax, one paragraph diction. Like, you're totally not getting the sophistication point if you write that way. So you got to begin to link the terms, devices, techniques together. So let me take it from the top here. Right from the onset, the narrator exonerates herself from the collective short-sightedness by placing heavy emphasis on plural pronouns. So we have syntax. We're going to focus on that we, the frequent use of we. The decades that separate the last encounters of both factions also serves as the central dichotomy that divides the old versus the new generation. So we're going to focus on that generational gap. So we got syntax, we got dichotomy, but of key importance is the judging diction used to describe the prodigal's homecoming. So our students noted that as the piece progresses, the diction's very harsh in the beginning in terms of judging the prodigals, and then it softens as the old crew, the old country folk welcome them back into their loving embrace. The diction really softens. So, all right, let's break this down then. What do we need to do? First premise, 3 sentences, literary argument, steal the stem right from the onset. So what my students do and what I do when I model for them how to write this, at the end of my first premise, I stop and I go quote hunting. I need quotes and or paraphrases about those pronouns. I need quotes and or paraphrases about that dichotomy. And then I need quotes and or paraphrases about that diction, right? If I'm going to keep my line of reasoning, I must provide those 3 things because I promised you that. And we got to keep in mind, the first premise is a promise, right? So all the quotes, all the paraphrases need to be germane to the promise of the first premise. So let's skip to the 4th sentence, which marks the beginning of the second premise. And everything on this slide is what's comprised in the second premise. So you're going to see quotes and or paraphrases for all the 3 things that were promised. I have another sentence stem here, and it's immediately, comma. So this ties back to right from the onset. So when you say immediately, you're going back to your mention of the plural pronoun. So you're going to go in order. Again, have mythology, have mythology, have a methodology, go chronologically, have a sequence. So immediately, Peinato parallels a long succession of sentences that begin with the we pronoun. So in the 4th sentence, my students usually quote. It's kind of hard to quote syntax, so they just quoted the we pronoun. It is important that we were the first generation to leave our island country, and that we were the ones who developed a distinct float to our walk on the day we came of age. Now, you quote, you got to analyze, but there's something about quoting that I want to talk about. I call it the 5-word rule. If a student places a minimum of 5 words in front of the quote and keeps the quote small, it should sound conversational, and if it doesn't, use a bracket. So you'll see my students do that a little bit in this. Quote, analyze. The narrator did not act alone, which to her sense of rationalization makes the decision less burdensome to carry. Clearly, this newer generation thought that they collectively held something over the heads of the old traditional cultural norms. Early in the story, this sentiment is captured in that the we went about their lives, somersaulting with the clouds, all while jackknifing confidently with their air of superiority, right? So I really got to unpack the we, right? Because that's a promise. And now we got to get into that dichotomy, because that was the second thing we promised. But immediately upon their homecoming, the airborne prodigals realize the peace they'd broken by returning is palpable, and that their presence is like a suspect stench. So this is something I think students need to learn how to do too. quoting once, twice, three times in one sentence. Very sophisticated. It's real tight diction analysis. When you can word play with your quotes like that, this student did that beautifully. There's two quotes in one sentence. When you're in contention for the sophistication point, I think you need to be able to do that type of stuff. It's like very heightened, very advanced composition. So that was done well. Again, quote, analyze. This return home makes them realize something that seems to have eluded them. What they did is nothing less than an act of betrayal. While the prodigals initially recoiled at how little the place fit them anymore, they find that they had to beg to be let back into the good graces of the people they abandoned. A sense of regret seems to permeate the narrator's sentiment. She distances herself from the collective we and finds a comfortable solace and appreciation when they begin to reminisce about their shared past. Those things she turned her back on, like how to eat kale, huta, solomon, and acaroles, I don't know how to pronounce that stuff, are what actually bind them together. All right, so I have quotes and or paraphrases in here for everything that was promised in the first premise. That is key to establishing your line of reasoning and keeping that line of reasoning intact. But you're not done. You just can't abandon a body paragraph on a quote. You have to conclude it. So my students just wrap it all back to the prompt and the thesis and keep the promise of the first premise. Usually takes like 2 sentences. So look at this. Well-trodden paths are well-trodden for a reason. The lives who left their mark and built their legacies are to be cherished, not looked at with an air of judging disdain, right? Very cool. So again, if you're following with me and hosting your own writing workshop, I'd pause here and model a couple of first premises with your students, have them share their work, go quote hunting, and then cobble the whole thing together and see how it works. 10 to 12 sentences, 3 sentences for that first premise. Keep the vocab up. Focus on those sentence structures, and voila, you have yourself a syllogistic body paragraph. But you may say, Christian, your kids only write 2 paragraphs. No, 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 no. They have more to do. So what do you do next? You need to bust out another syllogism. And it's this simple, my friends. What are we going to do? You're going to reload the first premise, 3 sentences, change your terms, devices, techniques. We still have the middle of the short story to analyze and then that poignant end. We haven't even talked about the end yet. And that's like such a poignant moment at the end there. We got to get that into our second body paragraph. So what my students do is they'll just bust out another 10 to 12 sentences with that 3-sentence first premise, different quotes, different paraphrases, different terms, devices, techniques. And again, just go syllogistically. Every body paragraph on this exam can be written syllogistically. And then teachers and students often ask me, Christian, how many paragraphs do your students write on the exam? 4 paragraphs, intro, 2 bodies, conclusion. If they're writing 10 to 12 baggers for their body paragraphs, then 4 paragraphs is plenty. Like I find those kids that have the really small paragraphs, they're going to need the 5th paragraph, but then you're going to get ding dong for organization, and it's going to be pretty dutiful and plotting, I think. So big, substantial body paragraphs seem to do the trick. All right, we're not done yet. How are we going to wrap this essay up? We have to throw a conclusion on it. Let me show you one of my sentence stems. So I have about 15 sentence stems that my students have at their disposal. And we just kind of usually end with a big thematic crescendo, like a fireworks display at the end of the essay. It's very theme driven. And one sentence stem that we have is simply said. So this student finished her essay this way. And again, 3 to 4 sentences is all a conclusion takes. Simply said, old paradigms of being are not rendered as less than just because a collection of people create something new under the guise of being better. Further, just because many subscribe to the promises of groupthink, it does not necessarily mean that the masses are correct. And that's just one way to wrap it up. So a big thematic crescendo. We are at the end, my friends, of this video writing workshop. So one of the things I always say is this: happy teaching and happy writing. And to wrap things all the way up, let me state this. If you need to contact me for any reason, have questions or comments, concerns, anything of that nature, drop me a line at teachingwritingcoach@gmail.com. I also am a lead teacher for the National Writing Project, and we offer professional development throughout the calendar year. On my webpage, which is www.teachinghowtowrite.com, up in the tab there's a link that says My NWP Courses. Hit that tab and you'll see everything that's being offered. During the summer, we have a very cool course. It's called FRQ Bootcamp, and we're going to do it for Lang and Lit. And there's plenty of information on my website about that. I think NWP, I'm going to say this assertively, confidently, they are the most affordable PD. So for a nominal fee, you can get a killer professional development. So if you really want to shore up how to teach the FRQs and do my Word Study Academy, my Nuance Academy, my alternative grading methods, then this is going to be a fantastic professional development opportunity. We offer a self-paced course as well, because I know time is an issue for many teachers. We have busy lives. I also do my 5-week Teach It Right Mastermind and my alternative grading methods. So everything can be found there, teachinghowtowrite.com. So be well, be happy. I hope this suits you well and your students benefited from it and that they grow and mature as writers. Take care for now.